Good afternoon. Welcome to session 6H, which is Local Stormwater Management Initiatives. My name is Bill Brown. I'm with the Association of State Floodplain Managers and the Flood Science Center. I'll be your moderator for this session. We have 3 presentations coming up here, a couple of things to be aware of. As many of you are already well aware, we'll do the questions after each one of the presentations are completed. For those of you out there on the right side of your window under the Q&A, that's where you enter in your questions. I ask a question that you were going to ask or you think is a good question. Click on the thumbs up button. That way it'll help rate it. I will read the questions based upon the most popular because I'm trying to answer as many of the questions as best possible with the interest. So with that, let's introduce the first presentation. Given by Matt Stahl and Canon Henry with Halff and Associates on the Fort Worth Storm Drain Rehab Program. So with that, let's go to the presentation. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to our presentation. My name is Canon Henry and I'm a professional engineering manager for the City of Fort Worth. Today, I, along with Matt Stahl of Halff Associates, will present to you Fort Worth Storm Drains Rehabilitation Program, Cowtown's approach to Wrangling storm drain. Our team of city staff and consultants has developed and is currently implementing a proactive storm drain rehabilitation program for the City of Fort Worth. This is primarily a strategic shift of our stormwater program master plan. We're now focusing more on maintaining the infrastructure the city currently has in place. This starts with the storm drain we already have an inventory on and includes the open channels which are currently being inventoried and assessed. As the city's stormwater infrastructure manager, I'll lead off by sharing how this program came about long before Alexis, oh yes, Alexis fell into the storm drain sinkhole. This photo is a perfect example of why developing and implementing a storm drain rehab program is so important to the city. Rule of any performance-based activity, evaluating the lessons learned. So jumping right into things, let's just discuss some of the elements of the background of the storm drain rehab program. The City of Fort Worth Stormwater Utility was established in 2006 with a dedicated funding source for drainage. Along with the dedicated funding source, bonds were sold which allowed the program to support the following objectives. O&M, our maintenance program, which ensures our drainage systems are clean and functioning properly. Planning, which handles all our citywide drainage planning efforts and drainage studies. Development services, which performs drainage reviews for new development and makes sure our standards and criteria are up to date. Equipment and technologies, the purchase of maintenance equipment and vehicles. GIS, our inventory. Our work order system, we use the Acela. Flood mitigation projects, stormwater communications such as newsletters and social media. Over the years, we have transitioned from bonds to a pay-as-you-go financing source. As well as in 2018, as a means of providing more direction to our program, we established a stormwater master plan. Overall, our stormwater master plan provides everyone with a well-developed, written, strategic direction of where the program is headed. Also, the plan details the key initiatives and priorities of the stormwater program, whereas the storm drain rehab program is a key initiative and is also defined as a level 1 priority. As you can see in this slide, conditions like these that are underground, which may create a damaging cave-in that's possibly can capture any vehicle, like in the photo at the beginning of our presentation, allows the storm drain rehab program to be a high priority initiative for our department. This initiative allows us to enhance the safety in the city of Fort Worth by knowing where the bad conditions are located. It also allows us to be more proactive versus reactive from an O&M standpoint. The program allows us to prioritize and do more with less, which overall allows us to improve on our level of service. A fundamental and ongoing task that is integral to the storm drain rehabilitation program has been to develop the framework. Some key considerations of the framework are the level of service and key performance indicators, which includes targets for system operations, providing service during storm events of varying magnitude, repair turnaround time, and maintenance schedules and goals, as well as specific program tasks, along with manpower and staffing assignments. So here, our framework on the CCTV or the storm drain rehab program, on our cleaning access, our stormwater fill ops handles that. And inspection is currently being handled by contract, but it's soon to be transitioned to in-house. Assessments, needs that are identified, prioritizations is handled by consultants, corrective actions are done by contract, and also by our field operations. The important first steps is to address the known issues. In our initial storm drain assessment, initial project prioritization ranked 16 known projects using basic consequence of failure criteria, which are proximity to structures, pipe size, and easement status. Easement status is an important factor for constructability, and we work with a realtor professional to perform easement research and verification. Probability of failure, refine prioritization with existing CCTV inspection data. Staff knowledge workshops to discuss and document institutional knowledge about systems maintenance, rehab, failure, and priority areas. Now at this time, I would like to transition over to Matt, who will dive into what has transpired with the program.
Okay, thanks, Cannon. My name is Matt Stahl, and I'm a project manager with Halff Associates in our Fort Worth office. Over the past 22 months, Halff has partnered with Fort Worth Transportation and Public Works Department to develop and implement the storm drain rehabilitation program for proactive storm drain renewal. So let's dig into how we are assessing storm drain condition with a standardized, repeatable method that allows us to gather high quality data to first track asset condition and second to contribute to risk prioritization. So this is the condition assessment process that we have used during year one of the program. It starts off with the criticality and consequence of failure evaluation for that initial priority that Cannon just covered. The next step was to prepare for CCTV. This involves some pre-CCTV inspections, securing access to storm drains where there was issues, and collecting the data that's associated with that. Then comes the CCTV data collection itself, along with QC and processing. We then use the CCTV along with the consequence of failure for prioritization and evaluation of corrective actions. We then move into performing those corrective actions, which can include anything from cleaning to point repairs, rehabilitation, replacement, and even monitoring. We then update the storm drain databases that are involved in this cycle and repeat the cycle typically on an annual basis to work towards that goal of proactive system maintenance and renewal. So to dig into the program a little bit more in the inspection approach, for CCTV inspections of the storm drains, we're performing those on a map shed basis to work towards that goal of proactive CCTV. As Cannon mentioned, that is initially on a contract basis, but the city does want to implement that skill set through its field operations group to have that capability in-house. we are conducting the inspections on a manhole-to-manhole basis as opposed to by pipe segment. However, every single storm drain in the system does end up with a condition score and a risk score. The scoring approach itself, we're using NASCO's PACP system. So we're keeping that pretty standard on the front end, but then post-processing takes place on the back end during QC to score only the defects that are relevant to storm drains. As far as some big picture goals, we're aiming to inspect between 25 and 50 miles of the system per year. We want to work towards that goal of proactive and strategic inspection and maintenance management. We're utilizing a risk-based prioritization system and implementing that with custom GIS tools. And lastly, we're working towards being able to perform predictive condition modeling of the likelihood of failure by using the historical data patterns. And we'll talk more about that here in a few slides. Just a few examples of what we're seeing out in the system. This is a fairly severely offset joint. So this is a good example of where a point repair would need to take place to correct that joint before a trenchless rehab method could be applied. Another example is this wall collapse. This is an arch pipe over in the Arlington Heights neighborhood, and pretty severe wall collapse here. Again, a point repair would need to be performed here before one of the trenchless methods of lining or spray on or other trenchless rehab could be applied. This example shows some pipe deformation. The degree of deformation is an important consideration when we're looking at trenchless methods. Typically, manufacturers don't recommend using the trenchless methods if there's more than about 10% deformation. And even if there's not quite that much, we really evaluate these carefully. This is another consideration, something we're looking at. Another offset joint seen here. This example shows some of the loss of embedment that was a likely contributor to this joint failure. And last example, more on the O&M side, we see a blockage here that would need to be cleared and cleaned to enable the proper functioning of the system. So as far as our scoring approach, the city is, as I mentioned, looking to build in this skill set, being able to perform its own CCTV inspections. For that, they're looking to purchase equipment that's appropriate for storm drains. So things like high clearance crawlers, cables that have armoring, just for all the crazy things that you can find out in the storm drains. The scoring system itself is PACP based. So using that, we've developed a standardized pipe condition score that's applied to every pipe that gets inspected. And with that score, we're using the NASCO algorithm to convert from the condition score to likelihood of failure. And so we follow that approved method by NASCO, and then convert that actual condition score to a 10 scale so that it's compatible with the risk-based scoring that the city is using. Just to show you a few of the deliverables that we're providing for capital projects. On the left, we have a summary of site defects. This is just a nice snapshot, kind of on one page of defects, considerations, any risks that might have been observed at the site, as well as rehabilitation method recommendations. So the methods that would be appropriate for each of these sites, as well as those that might not be appropriate for different reasons. And there's also a cost estimate planning level that's provided there. Then on the right, we see a plan and profile sheet. We're preparing these using CCTV data as well as information. And we find that the combination of these two deliverables, it provides a nice handoff of what's been investigated about each of these pipes and projects, what we've learned through the inspection and the evaluation process, and to be able to effectively hand that off to the capital project group that will carry this forward into the bidding phase. Another data deliverable that we're preparing is shown here. So this is a web map service. Basically what we're doing here is leveraging the Stormwater Development Services viewer. This is an existing viewer that's already in use by Transportation and Public Works for drainage reviews and other purposes. So we're using that and we're able to add to that existing service map services. These allow us to provide data in an up-to-date format with secure data access. And most of these layers, they can range from CCTV to pipe recommendations, corrective actions, different inspection routes, a whole variety of data products. Most of those are read-only, and they're for reference, for evaluating the projects going forward. But we are, right at this time, actually implementing a collaborative layer, which is the recommendations for corrective action. And so we're really excited about this. It's going to allow us to improve the collaboration between the city groups that are participating and building the storm drain rehabilitation program. So our next task is to prioritize the storm drains for rehab, replacement, monitoring. So let's talk about how the city of Fort Worth is doing this. So within an established program framework, a business risk exposure approach allows us to combine the condition scores that we're collecting through CCTV along with consequence of failure scoring to prioritize storm drains for corrective action. The city's software framework to do this includes IT pipes, Excella as the work order system, and the Esri suite of products, along with some customized ArcGIS toolboxes. And these are allowing us to prioritize data using a risk matrix. So that risk matrix shown as a couple of tables is on the right-hand side of the slide. So up top, we have the probability of failure, also known as likelihood of failure, and the criteria that we're using along with the weights. And then on the bottom is the consequence of failure. So again, that probability of failure, those criteria are attempting to estimate when the asset is going to fail. The consequence of failure is looking more at the impact that failure of that asset would have. You can also see the risk expression that we're using. And so the plan is to use these criteria shown for the first year or two of the program, and then evaluate those for accuracy, see how they're working, and update as needed. So there's certainly many ways to prioritize assets. Methods can range anywhere from spreadsheet approaches to GIS methods up to proprietary software. What we have found to work best is a custom risk prioritization toolbox that we've developed in ArcGIS, and we use that to establish the baseline risk score and rank. The next step after establishing that baseline is to apply information from the CCTV inspections and as well to refine the risk criteria. So basically what that process looks like as we apply the risk criteria, that first step, as I mentioned, is to use the surrogate probability of failure information. So for pipes that have not been inspected, to make an estimate of that probability or likelihood of failure. We evaluate those results, performing things like the correlation analysis shown here on the slide, just to make sure that those criteria are being applied as intended and that those results make sense. And then the second prioritization is using the condition information. So using that CCTV and the standardized scoring, then we take the results from that prioritization, apply different project modifiers and engineering judgment to come out with the final prioritization. So I'd like to perform a quick demonstration here just to show you what this GIS-based prioritization looks like in action. And it's a nice little tool and really lets us quickly evaluate and reprioritize storm drains really as needed. So here we are in the GIS environment. We see the storm drains there in blue showing up on the map. Over on the left, we have the ARC toolbox. And at the bottom, you can see the custom ArcGIS toolbox that's added to this project. This lets us look at the probability and consequence of failure as well as the risk score and rank. So you see there's basically a tool for each of the risk criteria that we saw on the table a couple slides back. We're going to apply those risk criteria to everything we know about the system. All the attributes that are shown here for the storm drains. You can see that we have added some standardized fields one for each of those risk criteria. And those are going to roll together over here at the probability and consequence of failure and allow us to establish those along with the risk score and rank. We'll look at one example here today. This is the capacity score. This tool gives us access to all the layers that we have in ArcGIS. And basically what we're doing here is taking a pre-established capacity grade that's comparing the capacity of the pipe with the runoff to that pipe. So the tool is running here, and it's very quickly going through, evaluating all of these 51,000 pipes that we have in the data set. And so we've scored for this particular criteria, the capacity score, where the pipes with an F get that higher score, pipes with an A get a lower score. And so we follow that same process for each of the risk criteria. And those roll together to give us, in this case, the probability of failure composite score. So we'll pull that up just to show you the weights that are completely editable, that can be refined and changed as needed. And those all, of course, add up to 100%. So this is very much a very transparent process. It's not a black box. And we like it because we can really see what's driving the results based on the data. So here we see those results in the map view, with red being the highest risk for probability of failure. And you can zoom in and look at any of the data that's driving this and producing our scores. So to move on, the last task in our cycle here is to select and implement the appropriate corrective action. As part of the storm drain rehabilitation program, we like to prepare kind of two types of deliverables. First are these near-term deliverables that have more actionable near-term information. So typically, these would be on a 10-year type planning cycle, such as the first table at the top, which is a 10-year condition assessment schedule. Now this is based on our risk results, and it's organized by MapShed. This is the way that for the city of Fort Worth, we're conducting these inspections and proceeding through the system. And then another example of a near-term planning tool is this utility conflict prioritization table. We're seeing lots more of these utility conflicts these days, so it's important to keep track of them. The second type of deliverable are these longer-term deliverables. We like to prepare tools such as this 50-year look at rehabilitation costs. We find this is helpful to for the city to be able to aid budget projections and to more effectively communicate the needs of the program to stakeholders and to city council. So as far as the corrective actions, it's important to select these with a standardized systematic method that can be repeated. To do this, we use a rehabilitation methods matrix, selection matrix. The focus with this are the trenchless methods. So you see most of these shown on the table are trenchless methods. As part of corrective action selection, we've helped the city to put together a best value bidder package and selection process. That got started last summer, and early in fiscal year 20, the first 4 projects, I believe it was, went out for bid and were awarded. So those are in progress right now. So to wrap up, after 22 months of partnering with the city to develop and implement the storm drain rehabilitation program, we've learned a few things. So shown here is one of the older arch pipes that's under downtown. Despite its age and being one of the older pipes in the system, it's really remarkably well preserved. So just to use this as an example, the age is really only one of many factors that drive storm drain maintenance and renewal. A few more lessons learned. Number 1, strategic planning. Approaching this type of program with a cycle, with a framework, with established workflows that can be standardized and repeated, it's really important and really contributes to the success of the program. Number 2, being in tune with stakeholder priorities and the goals of the stakeholders, working together with stakeholders as partners in the program. It's also a real key to success. Number 3, measuring success. As part of the program, we have worked with the city to define level of service goals that make sense, and then to develop key performance indicators to help us measure progress towards those goals. Number 4, getting started with the information, the data that you have, condition data and other data. This is also a real key. Nobody has information that's 100% accurate about their whole system. Nobody has condition data about their whole system, or even close to the whole system. So getting started with the information you have as a subset, as a sample, that allows the program to gather momentum and to start progressing. Number 5, the understanding the differences between storm sewers and sanitary sewers. There are some key differences. It's important to recognize those and to set up scoring and prioritization to reflect that. Number 6, prioritization is a fine balance between the risk-based approach and constructability. This business risk exposure is certainly the basis of the prioritization that we're performing for the city, but constructability considerations are really just as important. Things like proximity to buildings that Cannon mentioned, easement status, distance to access points, proximity to other subsurface utilities, and capital project opportunities that might be coming up, just to name a few. It's important to strike the right balance there. And lastly, number 7, collecting the right data today for data-driven decisions tomorrow. And just to expand on that, by collecting and building the right data set today, what we're doing is enabling some powerful analyses in the future. Things like predictive modeling of the probability and likelihood of failure that use historical trends of where and when the system has failed. Moving forward, a robust storm drain data set will help the city to catch failure before it happens using methods like this. So with that, we're really excited about the Fort Worth Storm Drain Rehabilitation Program's growth. We're looking forward to strategic advancement of the program through the rest of year 1 and beyond. And Cannon and I thank you for joining us today. And with that, we can take any questions that you might have.
Okay, we're back live, and we've got Cannon and Matt here to answer your questions. So let's go to the first question here. Could you talk about the process of securing funding necessary to pursue this approach? How did you position storm drain rehab as a priority relative to other funding priorities?
So one of the things we've noticed is that, again, with our master plan that we've come up with, that a strategic focus has been for us to maintain more of our infrastructure. And we start off doing a lot of large projects. However, we noticed that a lot of the money that we need to maintain our infrastructure needed to go to such things as CCTV, our vegetation maintenance, inlet cleaning, things of that nature. So with the storm drain rehab, we took a good stab. I say initially earmarked off close to, I think, about $500,000 in regards to the program itself. Some of that money will go towards building the framework. Some of it will go towards CCTV, and then also as part of it, we comes back and we get the assessments or the recommendations. So that's really an ideal thing. And as we ramp up through the year or over the next fiscal year, we're ramping that up to be a little bit more aggressive on the rehab program itself.
Okay. Do outputs from this process include any input to the city's CIP prioritization? You know, how does this lead to prioritization with the capital improvement plan?
Okay, so initially our capital would have more of some, I would say, static projects, some projects they've already been studying and have been doing design and consulting work on for years. But as we gather the data and we have these go over to capital, they'll prioritize those with somewhat of a reactive funding. They have an established funding to address any type of reactive or non-program capital needs as we go on throughout the year. So as we do more TVN, more assessments, we're actually taking a backlog of those and sending it over to our capital to utilize their funds on the reactive side.
Yeah, and that's definitely been one of our big goals, to add to the backlog that's available for the capital delivery group. And that's honestly one of the challenges of this project and the program, is to get our arms around all the data that's involved, all the condition assessment, the rehab recommendations, staying current with all that information, and turn it into recommendations that we can pass along to capital delivery, that they can bring into the mix with, like Cannon said, all the other projects that they're juggling.
One last question, we've got time for it. How do you put this prioritization in perspective with those areas that are experiencing flooding that due to the lack of infrastructure? So those areas that don't have the infrastructure necessary to deal with that, how do you level that out?
That's a very good question, and it's a balancing act. You have a large city, such a city of Fort Worth, which is over 400 square miles, and you have citizens or I would say infrastructure that is there. So we are trying to maintain the infrastructure that is there in place. So we do earmark off and set aside the maintenance on that and also the repair on that. So there is some locations where we do have some flooding going on. So we earmark those, set that dollars aside, but also for those areas we need to study, we do take a proactive approach. We do have I guess a potential high water layer that we know where potential flooding is, in addition to our FEMA floodplain. So we're taking a kind of proactive stance on it because we know the areas and we engage our citizens and we listen to them in regards to customer complaints. But at the same time, we have to maintain what we have.
Okay, thank you. We'll be moving on now to our next presentation. It's by Tamara Cook and Jeff Neal with the North Central Texas Council of Governments, and Jerry Cotter with the Fort Worth District of the Corps of Engineers. They'll be talking to us about planning before growth. The presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jerry Cotter, Chief of Water Resources for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Fort Worth District. I'm going to be talking to you today about the planning of stormwater infrastructure. And to accomplish that, we're partnering with transportation infrastructure groups across the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Today, co-presenting will be Tamara Cook, Senior Program Manager for the Environment and Development Department at the North Central Texas Council of Government, and Jeff Neal, Senior Program Manager for the Transportation Department at the North Central Texas Council of Governments. Next slide, please. Flooding disasters are impactful. Flooding has impacted tremendous portions of the United States. We're seeing an increasing frequency and magnitude of events. In fact, in the last 5 years, Texas has experienced 160 fatalities. We are seeing also increasing costs associated with these flooding events. And since 2015, Texas has experienced over $150 billion in flooding damages. Nationally, our expenditures on flooding have gone from about $1 billion a year annually to $8 billion a year. The next slide here is the regional observed storms. And the concept I'm trying to present here is that we're experiencing storms in our region that are exceeding our infrastructure design levels. That black line that you see is the 24-hour rainfall for which we're designing infrastructure and setting our firms here in this region. Now, we did bring NOAA 14 in 2018, and that did increase the limits in parts of the state, but not in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So you can see we're experiencing storms that greatly exceed what we are designing our infrastructure for. Next slide. This is just simply a movie of the storms that are exceeding our infrastructure design levels for the period 2010 till now. So you can see if you live along the I-35 corridor or east, you are very likely to get one of these larger events that exceeds the infrastructure design levels that we are currently utilizing here in Texas. Next slide. So we're going to bring some new technologies to the table. And one of those is the ability to shift storms around. And so in addition to our standard hydrologic loading of looking at the 100-year, the 500-year, the various frequencies that you commonly see in the FEMA program, we're going to also be looking at these storms that we have actually seen that have hit the Dallas-Fort Worth area or very close by. And we're going to shift and use that as an alternative loading. So when we plan the stormwater infrastructure for that undeveloped portion of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in other words, focusing on prevention rather than response, we're going to look at this alternative loading of taking some of these storms that have hit very close to the Dallas-Fort Worth area or in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and loading the hydrology models with that. We're going to use a technology that the Corps has created called METView. This is available for the scientific and engineering community at the Hydrologic Engineering Center's website. There's training and full support on this. And I've got a couple of pictures here that show some events, and I'm just going to talk about one of those on Mary's Creek. And that's where we shifted a storm about 10 miles. There was a lot of debate about what is the actual 100-year flow at Mary's Creek. And we first studied the watershed where the storm had occurred, and then we duplicated those loss rates on the Mary's Creek watershed, played that storm, and what we saw was that the potential for flooding was much greater than previously understood. That storm was very close to what we would call a 100-year. Now, you know, that's hard to really define, but when you compared it against intensities and durations and frequencies of NOAATLAS-14, it comes out pretty close to a 100-year. But yet when we played that natural storm on this watershed, we had much higher discharges than had been previously understood. So this is not regulatory. You know, we're still regulating in the NFIP program to the 100-year event. However, this gives you an alternative loading. You can put this into your hydraulic models and you can generate inundations. And what do you do with these? Well, communities can make freeboard decisions. They can also look at critical infrastructure, electrical substations, a hospital, ingress and egress, and they can make adjustments. And so that when one of these events does hit that community, it's not going to put them out of business and cause a long recovery time if they've made these adjustments. Next slide, please. So in addition, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that determination of the 100-year event. And not to belabor this a long period of time, but we have a heavy reliance on statistical hydrology in this region. And what we see is as you get new observations, that answer that's computed using those techniques changes significantly. And this upper slide here is the Wimberley area where we lost 11 lives in 2015. 2 6-year-olds and a 4-year-old were lost. Their bodies have not been recovered. And what this shows is that using that statistical hydrology, which was employed, that you can, depending on when you make that computation, set those floodplains inordinately low. And that's what happened. Those were set in the mid-90s at around 30 foot of stage, but we've seen those as high as 49 feet. And with current observations, that computes out at 42 feet or 12 feet higher. And we did raise that floodplain in Wimberley about 12 feet in after action. Next slide. We also know that adding impervious cover and depleting valley storage are huge impacts. And so we have techniques where we can examine the loss of valley storage and the impacts of impervious cover. And we'll be using that with these techniques to look at what those impacts will be. And part of this will be providing information to these communities that we need to preserve valley storage. We need to set up stormwater infrastructure, i.e. detention ponds to offset the impacts of this increased impervious cover. But I do want to stress, we're not just looking to offset only the loss of valley storage and increase impervious cover. but also we're going to look at these larger storms. Next slide. So the human toll is tremendous. Like I said, we've lost 160 lives here in just the last 5 years. You can see these photos on the left are recent photos. Houston during Harvey. I can't imagine being in an event like this. The Brazos River, the Dallas area. On the right here is an actual event, and we'll use this storm as part of our loading that occurred over the Arlington area, which is part of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where we experienced $17 million in buyouts, tremendous impacts. It was an emergency situation. People had to be evacuated. Next slide, please. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Neal with the North Central Texas Council of Governments.
Thank you very much, Jerry. And I think when you begin to look at this issue and those pictures that were included in the previous slide, it's certainly no coincidence that you find flooding occurring along areas where there were or are roadways. We see in many cases when you're looking at urban developments all over this country, all over the world, it's usually transportation infrastructure and stormwater infrastructure that precedes a lot of the urban growth and development that we see. But as you also saw in previous slides, those facilities are built based off of the identified 100-year or lower, depending on your regulations. It depends on the flood level identified at the particular time that that facility is built. In many cases, it's built with the idea that the surrounding landscape is going to have the same land use or similar land use as what exists at the time that that roadway is built. We know in many cases roads that were built 30, 40, 50 years ago are handling travel demands, are handling many other loads to it, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that cities have developed all around them. And with a metropolitan area growing as fast as the Dallas-Fort Worth area has, along with many other metropolitan regions in the country, this information shows that we have to consider more of an integrated approach when you're looking at planning for transportation and stormwater infrastructure together. If you'll go to the next slide, we're already in a process right now through our current surface transportation bill, which is called the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, moving more to a performance-based realm of transportation planning. The idea that we want to set coordinated targets with our local, state, and federal partners on the condition of our facilities, whether it be safety or pavement and bridge. Of course, in this case, for this particular project, pavement and bridge condition are extremely important because we want to understand how conditions, especially given the lack of consistent financial resources, what all may be affecting the attainment of specific targets. What are the risks associated with setting targets perhaps too high? We need to account for events like severe weather impacts and other things in order to understand how best to set performance targets out in the future, knowing that that has a great impact on prioritizing certain projects, whether they be expansion-oriented or maintenance-oriented, to ensure that we're meeting the objectives that we're setting in the future. Next slide. And of course, this has a direct impact on our long-range transportation planning, because here is basically where we set the blueprint, the vision for transportation planning in the region. What you see here is from our current long-range metropolitan transportation plan, Mobility 2040, and it's indicating the anticipated, reasonably expected expenditures we think we'll be able to make. In one instance, in the tables above, where we're trying to maximize the functionality of the existing system, while also ensuring we're making strategic investments to allow for continued growth, knowing that we need to build more facilities and more capacity to accommodate them. But you will see that we've dedicated, at least at this point, a significant amount of greater resources toward expansion of the system. And then when you look at the amount that we've preserved in planning when it comes to growth, development, and land use strategies, only 3.2 billion of the 135 billion we're expecting to spend. Clearly, we need to dedicate more resources toward understanding the impact of land use strategies and maintenance on the current state of our system, because we need to make sure that we're maintaining what we have as we're continuing to build more of what we need in the future. Next slide, please. Now, this becomes even more important when people realize that even when you're looking at the roadway system is very different from the perspective of what the locals are taking care of, what the federal government's taking care of, what the state is taking care of. Those performance measures I mentioned in a previous slide were primarily based off of what we call the national highway system. Usually includes our interstate highway facilities and major state-owned roadways. But one of the interesting things about Texas, as well as states like California and other locations, is there are a significant amount of national highway system facilities that are not owned by the state. In fact, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, our region has nearly half of those NHS facilities that are not owned by the state. So what does that mean? It means that cities, counties, toll road authorities, in our case, the North Texas Tollway Authority, those entities also have to coordinate with state governments to make sure that we are addressing pavement and bridge condition across all of these facilities. It becomes a great deal more important when you consider that although national highway systems or the national highway system in our area carries a vast majority of our traffic, it only comprises about 14% of the overall lane miles in the region. So we have to go further to understand the effects of flooding and other impacts, and what we have to do to maintain our system. We have to go talk with a great deal more people, more entities, to make sure that we are comprehensively addressing system needs. Next slide, please. So when you look at the top 10 cities in terms of population in the Dallas-Fort Worth region, beginning with the city of Dallas and down to the city of Mesquite, they are spending significant amounts of money in their capital improvement programs on their streets. And while much of it is indeed being used for preservation, of course, we are a region of 7.5 million people growing to over 11 million by 2045. Much of these funds are being used for expansion. The problem is, from a maintenance and from an asset management standpoint, not all of those maintenance-oriented expenditures are tracked very well through the Metropolitan Planning Organization in most areas throughout the country. It also becomes difficult when you realize that as cities are converting their roadways to complete streets, for example, having bike lanes or better active transportation elements or transit-oriented components to it, responsibilities for those assets begin to shift. And so who then is going to be responsible for maintaining or expanding those facilities when the needs arise? It's important to make sure that we're tracking that and that we're developing sufficient tools to ensure that when we're thinking about severe weather impacts and other impacts, we're able to distribute the load a great deal more effectively. Next slide. Because as you can see, we're already realizing for those cities that are devoting a great deal more resources to asset management or tracking condition of their facilities over time, it's becoming more and more difficult to attain goals. You can see as you're looking at pavements for the city of Dallas, right now, despite spending over $500 million on streets, their current overall pavement condition rating is less than a goal that was set by the City Council back in 2006. The overall pavement condition will be less than what it is today, even after the $500 or plus million are spent. In fact, both of these cities indicate that they would have to spend a great deal more than what they are spending now just to maintain their current pavement condition. And this is extremely important when you realize that all of these facilities are greatly impacted, greatly burdened by increased travel demands, incidents, and severe weather events, because in many cases you see these assets deteriorating faster over time. And it just demonstrates the need that more than ever, we need to find ways to integrate solutions that can help with stormwater, transportation, and environmental infrastructure as much as possible, so that we can take advantage of consolidating our resources to get resources together and solving multiple problems, hopefully, at the same time. And going to the next slide, I'll go ahead at this point and turn it over to Tamara Cook to continue us forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so just wrapping up here, I think the slide demonstrates in a very quick nutshell exactly what we are hoping to achieve with this paradigm shift of a planning project that's really looking at integrating transportation and stormwater infrastructure and environmental infrastructure as well. So really looking at the green and the gray infrastructure and planning ahead to get ahead of the growth. So this case study is in North Fort Worth. I think it just demonstrates exactly what we're talking about. So all the roads on the right-hand side of the right-hand image there, those are planned. Wastewater infrastructure is planned. Water supply infrastructure is planned for all of these developments, all of these homes and businesses that are coming into the community. But a lot of times the stormwater is kind of an afterthought and really looked at on an individual site-by-site basis and the impacts for that site. And we really want to take a step back and look at the 30,000 foot view of, okay, if we are planning for X amount of homes in the future or land uses in the future, what is going to be that cumulative stormwater impact, the runoff impact from the additional impervious surface, and plan ahead for that. So looking at environmental features on a more watershed basis instead of mitigating or looking at opportunities to do small projects. We really want to look at large projects, large programs, green infrastructure, wetlands, all sorts of other stormwater infrastructure as well. So what are we hoping to do? It's exactly what Jeff just said. It's really looking at the transportation planning element. There's long-standing transportation planning that every 5 years from a regional perspective, we update the transportation plan. We want to integrate that with a regional approach to stormwater management planning in a specific region, western portion of our North Texas area. And then as a result of the modeling and stormwater runoff calculations from future land uses, we want to look at opportunities to deploy environmental elements and features that provide value and economic benefit to the communities and to the region, but also provide an ecosystem service as well. So just a quick snapshot of our project area. For anyone that's familiar with the Dallas-Fort Worth area, Dallas and Fort Worth are kind of down the southeast portion of this map. They are built out primarily. You can see that there is a strong delineation between the impervious areas of our region and the undeveloped areas of our region. So you can kind of see the gray areas, those are the impervious surfaces, whereas the more peach tan color, light khaki color is the undeveloped areas. And we really want to focus on a very large area. It's a very large area, couple counties, multiple cities, 86 cities to be exact, would be partners in this project in the red area. And really looking at how they've been developing over time and how they are hoping to develop in the future. For example, we do know that we have estimated that between 2020 and the year 2045, this particular area in the red line will increase in population by 126%. And that is huge. That is a huge amount of growth coming to an area that has historically been an undeveloped area, and it still is. And 60% of the land area in this area currently is undeveloped. So we really, that's our focus area that we really want to focus on, looking for tools and resources that we can provide these communities and these counties to better manage their floodplains that they currently have, give them new models, and develop a stormwater infrastructure plan to accommodate this future growth that they're going to see. So there's a lot of benefits to looking at a more comprehensive planning approach, such as this, where we're looking at not just the traditional gray transportation infrastructure, but really truly looking at what are the impacts of all this growth, excuse me, from a stormwater perspective. And one really good benefit of this is just dissolving the silos that we typically all work within. So even with in our own agency, today on the phone we have Jeff in our transportation department, and I'm a planner in our environment and development department, and we've been collaborating on this and working with Jerry from the water and hydrology side of things. So it's brought a lot of different partners together that typically don't work on projects like this. And that's really exciting because we all will come up with really neat ideas that we may have not come up with before. Additionally, it minimizes duplication and providing resources that we can all feel confident about that will actually help our communities be able to move forward with good decision making in terms of their growth. It also complements existing regional programs that we have that are longstanding. Again, complements the long-range transportation planning process that has been going on for a very, very long time. It creates positive financial outcomes. One of the facts that Jerry always likes to talk about is for every $5 to $7 that's invested in stormwater infrastructure, there's a $5 to $7 return on every dollar in stormwater infrastructure invested. That's much more valuable information. So it is beneficial for us to plan ahead and look at this as an opportunity to provide a financial benefit in the future to those residents that we will be passing the infrastructure on to. So just quickly wrapping up here, this project has numerous products and outcomes that we're hoping to achieve. What's shown here on the slide in those 4 boxes are really just some examples of some of the things that we are hoping to achieve through this work of this large project that we're going to be working on over the next 5 years. Transportation infrastructure, we want to take a hard look at kind of the future of transportation and what does that look like? Are there opportunities to do more of, I don't want to say lead transportation projects, but sustainable transportation projects, looking at a lot of green infrastructure and developing a plan for where to deploy that green infrastructure in this particular undeveloped area. Producing a lot of flooding models, looking at regulatory products that these local governments can use that are located in this region that they currently do not have access to, so that they can make better decisions about future development in their community. And then also really focusing on the environmental stewardship elements and looking at those as an economic asset to this particular part of our region, and how these economic drivers can also be environmental elements and features that are serving the community from a stormwater perspective, but also from an ecotourism perspective or economic development benefit as well. We also want to include emergency preparedness elements and emergency response and a whole other realm of products and tools as well for our communities to integrate into their hazardous mitigation plans and all sorts of other things that we want to look at. And in the end, what this does, we're really focused with our project on the analysis and tools development, but also policies and actions that cities can take. And in the end, they have to take those and incorporate those into their processes so that they can make better decisions about future development in their communities. So wrapping up, where are we now with our project? There are many phases to this very large scale project. It is quite an undertaking with so many partners involved and all the local governments that we're going to be serving through this effort. And right now we're really defining our final scope of work and submitting some elements to funding opportunities that are currently available in the state of Texas and through the Corps of Engineers and other partner organizations so that hopefully in the next fiscal year, we will be able to get started on some of the early modeling and outreach activities that need to occur with this particular project. But it is a long-term project. We're in it for the long haul. We're hoping that we can achieve this in about 5 years and have a lot of good products that will be available to the communities in our region. And then we hope to really build a model that could be used and replicated throughout the nation so that other regions or other areas that are experiencing tremendous amount of growth, such as this particular area, can use and replicate and hopefully have similar positive outcomes as we're hoping to achieve. So with that, we will be ready to take questions. Thank you for your time and thank you for the invitation to present at the conference.
Okay, we're back. We're here with Jerry Cotter, Jeff Neal, Tamara Cook, and we're looking for questions. So we do have one up here. In North Texas, Fort Worth area, are there concerns about sprawl? I'll figure that'll punt to you, Tamara.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Bill. In a very short amount of time, I would say the easy answer to that is yes. We are a tremendously quick growing region, as most people are aware around the nation. We are the 4th largest urban metro area in the nation. We do not see that growth stopping anytime soon, but we do recognize in partnership with our transportation department and other agencies around our region that we can't continue to do business as usual. And a lot of cities in our region have taken new approaches. I don't want to even call them new anymore, but for the last 20 years, growth of mixed use and transit-oriented development and other land use strategies has really increased in our region, providing a lot of alternative living and quality of life opportunities for residents. But we do still have very low density development happening out in our urban rural edge. So it is something that we're working on, making sure that everybody can grow the way that they want to grow and their community wants to grow, but still supporting a sustainable growth pattern over the next 20 to 50 years.
Okay, thank you. That pretty much eats up the time right now, but I do have one comment. I want to commend you on, I don't know how you did it. You got the transportation people to the table with the stormwater people. So however you did it, you might want to figure out how to bottle that and sell it, because that'll sell about everywhere else in the country. So really appreciate your presentation and thank you. So with that, we'll start getting ready to move on to the third presentation. Be by Byron Hinchey with S&ME. It's risks in site design. Don't forget about the offsite areas. So with that, we'll go to the presentation.
Good afternoon and greetings from Rocket City, USA, Huntsville, Alabama. I want to talk to you for a few minutes this afternoon about risk management and site design. Nothing earth-shattering or new in my presentation. It's really a presentation meant to serve as a refresher, a reminder about the need for competent engineering and a need for proper peer review. My presentation is based on a legal case that I've had some familiarity with, and it begins with the story of a proposed residential development. Typical development you might see anywhere, where we start with a vacant piece of property. We develop design plans, submit those design plans for approval, for permitting to the local community. Once approved, construction begins. One of the first things we do is lay in the infrastructure, including the drainage infrastructure, the stormwater control measures, which oftentimes serve as an erosion control during the construction process. But eventually we get to a beautiful completed development, a beautiful place where people want to live. This example takes place in an NFIP community, a community that's been involved in the NFIP since the early 70s, community that's been active in the community rating system and has been as low as a CRS rating of 6. Floodplain management, no stranger. One of the first questions asked in the development is, do I need detention? I'm going from a whole lot of nothing to a whole lot of something. I've got a relatively modest sized development at 38 acres. I'm going to go from a pasture field or an agricultural field to a medium density residential defined by local zoning. And in the end, as it was designed, the average home lot is about 0.4 acres. So between a third of an acre and half an acre. Do I need detention? Well, in most communities there, I would say you're going from nothing to something. The answer is probably yes. And that was the case in this particular situation. What were the design standards? Well, design standards vary greatly depending on where you are. Just as an example, in Alabama, since that's where I'm located, you see that design standards throughout the state vary wildly, but certainly they tend to be a little bit on the low side. Most detention basin requirements are for a pre versus post from the 2-year event up through the 25. If you go north of where I'm located into Middle Tennessee, let's say the greater Nashville area, then detention standards get a lot higher. A lot of communities in that area have standards of a 100-year design standard for a stormwater control measure, which means that you have to meet a pre versus post from the 2-year event all the way up through the 100-year event. In this particular case, in Anywhere USA, the design standard was a 100-year standard. Easy enough as a design professional, right? We have a certain development. We know what we want to build. We know what kind of storage volume we need. Easy engineering calculations, if you will. We do that as design professionals all day, every day, if you're in the site design process. In this particular case, they want a wet pond because they want that aesthetic feature on site with some flood storage above the normal water level of the retention basin. And all of that's controlled by some outlet structure, easily designed, easy part of a normal site design process. One of the things we often check is, will homes flood in and around our development? So in this particular case, we have homes stipulated on the plat at 36.7 being the minimum first floor elevation, particularly for a handful of homes that are low-lying in the vicinity of the retention pond we're designing. We stipulate on the plat that those homes have to be at a certain elevation to limit the risk of flooding in and around our stormwater control measure. So if the 100-year elevation for our pond is 30.35, the minimum elevation for the homes is 36.7, then we've got 3 feet of freeboard. And that almost certainly in most communities meets the standard for flood protection in this particular scenario. So should our homes flood in the development? Well, no, not based on what we know so far. They should not. But what if they do? So following a given storm event, let's say some of those low-lying homes do get flooded. They may call the community official, they may complain, they may ask, hey, what can you do for us? But ultimately, if they don't have some resolution, they may pick up the phone and they may call an attorney. Oftentimes, an attorney takes the case. That attorney may turn around to an engineer, let's say a forensic engineer, to say, hey, can you look at this situation and tell me if everything's on the up and up? Why did these people flood? Did perhaps something in the development process go wrong? So that expert witness, for lack of a better term, might pick up a drainage report and the design plans and the plat and other associated documents that go with that development. If you look at the drainage report for this particular example, certainly there's a section of the drainage report that deals with the stormwater infrastructure in the subdivision. Normally not a concern in a flooding situation, but it is something to look at because it may clue you into other things that are going on. In this particular case, the drainage report or hydraulic report or whatever your local community may call it, there was no narrative about the situation. It went straight into summary tables and output from either spreadsheet calculations or from design software. So as is typically done, the stormwater infrastructure was based on the rational method. For that rational method calculation, the 38-acre development was divided up into 24 smaller sub-areas to calculate discharges going into various inlets, various pipes. The software used in this particular case was PondPack, which is certainly appropriate for this particular type of stormwater design. PondPack spits out a pipe node report that gives you a lot of information about discharges and about elevations and slopes and lengths and sizes and all those typical things. And in this particular case, the drainage report included those reports for the 25 and the 100-year flood event. But if you look at some of the detail that's in the limited information provided, one of the things that you might notice is the calculation of the rational C. Is that appropriate? Well, going from a pasture to a medium density residential in this particular community, going from a 0.3 to a 0.5 pre and post was in the range of reasonableness. No red flag really for somebody taking a quick and easy look to see if things seem to be have done appropriately on the up and up, so to speak. One thing though that's quickly noticeable is the fact that none of the calculations, while you have area and a rational C equals, or discharge equals CIA, right? Well, there's no intensity listed anywhere in the drainage report. There's area, there's C values, but there's no rainfall intensity, which means there's also no time of concentration because those two are linked with the rational method. So there is something not quite right about the drainage infrastructure. There's some missing information. So we don't really know whether that looks reasonable or not because we don't have enough to go on. So you turn the page and you look at the detention calculation side of the drainage report and you see some similar things. There's no narrative to tell you how that was done. There are some calculations that came out of the software used. Again, PondPack. PondPack, again, is an adequate piece of software for this particular purpose. I will say that there is, regardless of the software you use, as a plans reviewer, we need to make sure that everything that is included in the drainage report, exports from those software packages, include all the input variables necessary for us to make some judgment about the output that we're seeing in front of us. In this particular case, the output from that software did indicate that the analysis was run for the 2 through 100, check, met the standard. There was rainfall depth, duration, frequency values in the output. Great, we needed that. It did indicate that the SCS method was used in developing the hydrograph to route through the detention pond. Awesome. Be careful because sometimes within this and other pieces of software, a rational method or a modified rational method may be used for detention design. And I would contend that unless your local standards explicitly say that's okay, the modified rational should never be used for a stormwater control measure design or a detention or retention based design. In this case, it wasn't. Hydrograph method, SCS method was used. We look at the variables that we can deduce from the summary tables and from the PondPack output. And we see once again that there's some information that we just don't have available to us as a plans reviewer. So the drainage report did not mention soils, which soils combined with land use and area, gives us the information we need for a curve number and for a development of a time of concentration. Ultimately going into the SCS method to give us a calculation of the pre-development peak flow, the post-development peak flow, and the volume perhaps that we need to detain to meet a pre versus post requirement. So again, missing information that really we need as plans reviewers to be able to adequately judge the reasonableness of a given proposed stormwater control measure. So in this case, there was a summary table said that the pre-development discharge at 137 from the pond packed output, a post-development discharge calculated at 143. Are those reasonable? Don't know. We don't have the backup information to be able to make a judgment on that one way or the other. I will say from a common sense standpoint, if I'm going from a whole lot of nothing to a whole lot of something, and my discharge only goes up 4%, that doesn't really feel right to me. So it might be worth digging a little deeper and asking for more information to be able to back check those calculations. The pond packed output did, as you would expect, present calculations and information pertaining to the post-development discharge, which ended up at 118. Since I don't have all the input variables I need to gauge the appropriateness of the calculation, I don't know if that's right or not, but it certainly at face value meets the standard 137 pre, 118 post. I've met the pre versus post requirement all the way up to the 100. I'm just focusing this presentation on the 100. So everything looks good. So what about the calculations of our stormwater control measure? In this particular case, the outlet of the retention pond was a weir. It was a two-stage weir. Two-stage where the weir number one, if you will, was 13 feet wide. It was at a certain elevation of 32.2, and 6 inches above that was the second stage of the weir at an elevation of 32.7. So a two-stage weir modeled in pond pack, which again is a perfectly adequate piece of software to make this type of calculation. Now, this particular designer did use pond pack, or maybe a version of pond pack, where the weir needed to be modeled not as a single complex structure, but as two independent weirs. Not uncommon in various software packages. One may quickly notice, though, within the drainage report that, and the design plans, that the two-stage weir wasn't modeled appropriately or correctly. So weir number two, representing 6 feet of a ledge on the left and 6 feet of a ledge on the right, should have been a total of 12 feet in width, but in fact was the entire width of the structure, which means that that calculation of 133.5 as a flood elevation might not be appropriate, because part of that area was counted twice in the calculation of the conveyance through that weir. Additionally, the performance of any given weir is based on the outfall. Is it submerged? Is it not? In this particular case, the outfall was modeled with a free outfall condition, meaning there is no tailwater condition whatsoever that would affect the hydraulic performance of that weir, or therefore the flood storage in the retention basin. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but you might get a feeling from the picture of this outfall structure, this weir, that free outfall condition might not be an appropriate assumption. But other things we consider when we're designing, right? Is anything draining to me? Do I need to have consider anything around my development passing through me, whether it goes through my detention pond or not? So everything, in this case, everything to the west discharges downstream of me. Everything to the north goes around me to the downstream side. Everything to the south drains around me or away from me. But there is a plot of land on the northeast side of my development, 35 acres, that's already in the development process as I'm designing my development. 35 acres that I acknowledge in my drainage report as being off-site, coming to me but yet I do not consider that in the calculations of my stormwater infrastructure on site, nor on my stormwater control measure, my retention pond. Also, though, to the east is another undeveloped piece of property, 25 acres, that drain toward me, that I also do not include in the calculations of my stormwater infrastructure nor my detention pond, but in fact I do acknowledge it's coming to me because I stub out my stormwater infrastructure to pick up both of these areas. So I am 35 acres. My offsite drainage coming into my development is 60 acres. And I acknowledge those in my drainage report, but I do not include those in my calculations. Should be a quick and easy red flag for any plans reviewer, whether that be inside the design firm or at the community level. What are the regulatory requirements in this case? In this case, and I paraphrase, that you have to consider that upstream area. You don't have to detain it, you have to consider it, and you have to consider it in your design as if it were fully developed. So not just 35 plus 25, 60 acres of undeveloped property, but based on zoning, you have to assume that that is in a developed condition, and you have to take that post-development discharge and route it through your development. What about downstream? Oftentimes we look, or is asked at the community level, does a particular development affect downstream flooding? Many different standards to meet, but typically in most communities there is a standard. You need to look downstream to make sure, even though you met pre-post at the boundary of your subdivision, what are the conditions offsite that you need to worry about? Are you going to flood somebody downstream or flood some other structure downstream based on hydrograph timing? In this particular case, there was no regulatory requirement in the local regulations. What about tailwater conditions? We mentioned a second ago, the downstream side of that weir didn't look like the greatest condition to be discharging to. So what am I discharging to? Is there a tailwater condition that I should take into account that affects my design? In this case, again, from a regulatory standpoint, that standard was not called out. So let's look and see what that is. There is a downstream channel that my development discharges to. Immediately downstream of my weir, there is a offsite drainage that comes into that same channel. Those two combine to flow through a decent looking channel to go downstream to the receiving stream, the ultimate receiving stream, which is a wet weather stream, perennial stream, that has its own inline retention basin because of past development in the area. And then a little bit further downstream, 1,000 feet or so downstream, we have a road crossing for the local community, as well as a subdivision road for the next downstream development. So a number of things downstream that probably should be considered in the design of my on-site stormwater control measures. One of the things we always look at is, our floodplain. Regardless whether you pull the paper map or you go to the online resources, you check and see in this case that no, you're not in a floodplain and you're not discharging to a floodplain. It's a zone X. Except that the design engineer knew better. The design engineer noted on their plans and ultimately noted on their plat, which is a legal document, right, filed with the court, filed with the local community, that there is a flood height on that receiving stream, in this case of 35.5. So even though it's not on a FEMA firm map, there is a locally known and acknowledged flood elevation that both the community officials and the design engineers should be cognizant of when going through the development process. So let's go back to our weir. It is a two-stage weir, as I mentioned. It has a normal water surface elevation that appears to be above the invert of the weir. It discharges to a 500-foot long channel that literally has zero slope to it. And in fact, there is riprap, probably for energy dissipation, located upstream, downstream, and in the throat of the weir. Not sure who put it there, don't have records for it, why it's there, but certainly impacts the hydraulic characteristics, the hydraulic calculations of the weir. As a sidebar, who maintains a pond and its outlet control structure? Well, certainly there's a need to maintain the storage volume for flood control. Whether somebody maintains the wet pool for aesthetics is another story. But besides the storage volume, there is the outlet control structure that certainly needs to be maintained over time for proper function. In this case, the regulatory standard is that the homeowners association is legally required to maintain that stormwater control measure. Where does a homeowners association get drug into a lawsuit? Well, maybe because over a period of time, the outlet control structure looks more like a small forest than it does a concrete weir. So much buildup that vegetative growth, certainly at least at face value, would appear to obstruct the proper form and function of that stormwater control measure. So will homes flood in the development? Well, they did. And we take a look at the flood calculation for the pond at 33.5. By now you get the idea that maybe that's a flawed elevation for many different reasons. But we had 3 feet of anticipated freeboard for the homes around the pond. But the receiving stream had a much higher flood elevation. So if we look at that in cross-section view, look at those critical elevations, we have a pond 5 foot deep, we have a calculated elevation that's well within range of reasonableness for the function of the weir, a little bit of freeboard on the weir itself, 3 feet of freeboard for the homes adjacent to the pond, but all of that discharges to a receiving stream that has a flood elevation 2 feet higher than that calculated for the weir. So that anticipated 3 feet of freeboard very, very quickly has gone down to a mere 1 foot or barely over a foot. And so without any upstream discharge, without any on-site discharge, just from the downstream channel, we have very little freeboard. We're above the flood height with our homes, but we have very little freeboard to work with. So takeaways for the presentation. First and foremost, know the regulations if you're a designer, a site designer. In this case, the firm does a lot of site design and they knew the regulations and they generally follow the regulations. But one thing I think we forget as designers is that the regulations are a minimum requirement to get a permit from whoever the regulatory officials at either the local, state, or federal level. Regulations do not equal the standard of care in our industry. They most certainly do not, just because you met a permit regulation does not mean that you have limited your liability very much at all, because if somebody is aggrieved, they can always hire an attorney, take you to court, and that's an expensive proposition. Stormwater may drive a development and how the development is laid out, or should in this case. You can't always start with how many homes I want on how much piece of property, and then, oh, by the way, where do we put our pond and how big does it have to be? In this particular case, the stormwater should have controlled the development, not the development controlling the stormwater. The technical analysis must be competent, and defendable in a court of law, not just arguable to the local community that has to review the design plans and issue a permit. So, those, regardless of the competency of those engineering calculations, they should be reviewed thoroughly internally at the design firm before they go to the local community for permitting. In this case, it would appear that there were a lot of omissions, maybe mistakes, maybe bad theory, maybe a bad approach, a lot of questions that should have been asked internally before the design plans and the design report ever made it out of house to go to the local community. I believe in most cases, you have mid-level or young engineers doing hydraulic calculations, doing stormwater management design, and the people that should be doing the reviews don't set aside enough time or enough budget to do a thorough review to mentor our younger professionals in order to make sure that what we turn into the regulatory community is worthy of our seal and is worthy of our corporate name. Externally, certainly in this case, there were a lot of red flags and a lot of omissions in what was turned into the local community. And I think it's fair to say that the local community could have done a better job in performing plans review, It feels like in this particular case that the community looked at the design plans, looked at pre-post, looked at the drainage report, said, oh, these people checked all the boxes. I know Billy Joe Jim Bob, so to speak. He's a good engineer, his firm's good, and so I'm just going to file that report away. Well, that's not due diligence on the part of the local community and the taxpayers we serve. Everyone in the development process is a potential target for a lawsuit. The only person involved in this particular process that wasn't brought into the lawsuit was the local community. So much easier to sue the developer, the owner, and the design professional, which gets back to why we as professionals should go above and beyond the minimum permit requirement and meet a certain standard of care to limit our liability and to lower our risk. And last but certainly not least, in this case, the lesson is manage your documentation. This design firm, by the time this went awry and went to court, they had had a server crash. All of their data had been converted to digital. All of their data, digital data on their server, was lost in a server crash. They had no backup whatsoever. So when it came time to give depositions or go to court, the design professional had your other resources to get documents in which to defend themselves. They no longer had any records in their own files that they could use in their defense, which is really sad and unfortunate for the design professional. So I'll leave you with that lesson learned. Always make sure that we have backups of our designs, so that we have historical information to go back to should we ever need it. I hope no matter which side of the development process that you're on, that you found something interesting or something noteworthy to take away from the presentation. Thank you for your attendance and your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, we're back now for our final question and answer session. With me is Byron Hinchey, who was the presenter. So let's kick in here to the first question, which is more of a comment. It says, the devil's in the details. Local governments need to have standards for drainage report submittals. Also, rigorous review checklists. The design outlet structures is an art. Not all engineers grasp the complexities. I think the point here is, what's your perspective on, those checklists or stuff? How important are they?
I think they're very important. A lot of large cities have those. Not every large city, but a lot of cities have those, but there's not a requirement for that. So even though this community, where this example came from, has been very active in CRS and been in the NFIP forever, they just didn't have those details. And certainly I would encourage any community to have written details, not only on what the design plans need to have on those, but what the drainage report needs to include. And I think the moral of this story is, from the community perspective, be sure you do a good thorough review of what's submitted, and don't just assume because it's got a sign and seal on it that it's good to go.
Okay, one of the questions is more of a comment. The public's automatic response is to blame or sue the city. And having spent almost 25 years in public works, I understand that comment very well. Design engineers expect the municipalities to perform their QA/QC that the designer should be performing prior to the submittal of their plans. I mean, do you find that to be the case in your experience? I will state that, yes, that was my experience.
Yes, historically that has been a problem. But what I have seen some communities do, and I spent a lot of time up in Nashville, Tennessee, working with their stormwater group, and they implemented a process where almost like a FEMA type checklist process. They go through the design plans, the drainage report. If it doesn't have all the components required for a thorough review, they won't even touch the review. They won't start the review. They will kick it back to the engineer, starts that clock all over again, if you will, and they won't let designers play that game any longer, where they tell their client, oh, it's out of my hands, the city's got it. So now the city's saying, no, we don't have it until you have a complete and thorough package submitted. We're not even going to start the review process. And I would encourage people to get strict like that.
Several of the questions or comments here is a philosophical question for you. It says, in your opinion, should the local governments have been held legally accountable as well for the designs that took place?
Well, yes, probably so. However, most attorneys that I've ever consulted with throughout my career, they do not like suing a government entity because it slows down the process. It becomes much more expensive. It's hard to fight City Hall, that whole mentality. And so plaintiff attorneys tend to go for the low hanging fruit, which is those people that have insurance like engineers, contractors, home builders. So that's where the process normally always begins. And only in very arduous situations have I seen people really go after the local community. But certainly I think there's some liability here in this case because they didn't do a really good job in reviewing what was submitted.
Okay. This will be the last question. It's kind of an interesting one that just came in here late. Is this, in your experience, have you seen a trend for HOAs, homeowner associations, to actually take care of their stormwater infrastructure, or do they believe it's more often that it's neglected?
I think the trend has always been that they ignore their stormwater infrastructure. I think that has been a huge problem with municipal governments, even to this day when they have maintenance agreements in place with those HOAs. The only time I've ever seen it be effective is where communities actually have the political will to say, you didn't maintain it. Our ordinance says we get to maintain it and charge you for it. And once that HOA has to go to court to fight that bill that they received from the community, they tend to just ignore it. So it's always been a problem, and it remains to be a problem, in my opinion, in most communities.
And I can attest, in my years, we had the same problem, and I actually had regulatory authority to go after them, and the city attorneys chose generally not to do it. So it always became a problem. So
I would like to end with one comment that I wish I'd added to the presentation, and that is this. So there's a philosophical in floodplain management at the community level. There's kind of a philosophical point behind this presentation, which is how far offsite, how far downstream should one have to look in deciding whether there is an offsite flood risk that affects my on-site design. In this case, the receiving stream was only 500 feet away, but I've consulted with an attorney recently in a different geographic area where that stream was literally almost a mile and a quarter away from the site. That flood height on that Zone A stream affects that development over a mile away. So in flat land USA, that controlling water surface elevation that we should take into account as engineers may not be anywhere close to our site. So there's a philosophical debate there. I would say there should be a philosophical debate in regulatory environment. How far away do we make people look when they go through those hydraulic calculations for their on-site design?
Yes, and I've experienced that personally also. And my standard at the time, which was overly controversial, was you went to the first downstream hydraulic restriction, or where it merged in with a stream, whichever was first. So that could be a fair distance, just like your scenario of a mile or so. But with that, we'll be wrapping up this session. That way people can go and hit the various vendors in your last session here. And we do have one more session following this. It starts in approximately 22 minutes. So give everybody an opportunity for their break. And with that, I thank everybody for their participation, our presenters, and good afternoon.